the question was like, how would you get this fact out there? I mean, you drive by a state capitol on any given day, there's people outside waving signs and yelling something. So that doesn't mean that they're in the news, and it doesn't mean anyone cares. So how are we going to get people to care? And the idea initially was, well, if we're going to talk about alcohol being so dangerous and marijuana being less harmful, where is that most obvious? And college campuses was the answer.
Welcome to episode 44 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. Today's episode features Mason Tvert, partner at VS Strategies and one of the most impactful people over the years on cannabis legalization in Colorado and beyond. Mason and I discuss how he got into drug policy reform and what it was like being one of the leaders in passing cannabis legalization in Colorado, which clearly had reverberations throughout the world in cannabis policy, drug policy, criminal justice reform, and beyond. Here is Mason Tvert on People Are the Answer. Mason, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Really, it's an honor. You're one of the people I had in mind when I came up with the name People Are the Answer. That's certainly been the case for you in drug policy.
I appreciate it. Really, it's been a pretty wild ride, and it's absolutely great if the work that we were able to accomplish here is helpful to those working in other areas.
Yeah, and I'm excited to dig into that. If you could just start off by telling our audience where you're based and what your current role is.
Sure. I am based in Denver, Colorado. I'm a partner at VS Strategies, which is a national drug policy, cannabis policy, public affairs firm. It's also the consulting affiliate of the Vicente Sederberg law firm. So we specialize in cannabis and other drug policy and everything from government relations to strategic communications and really anything around the changing public opinion, passing laws, and implementing laws related to drug policy.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I know that work can be complicated, but super impactful. And, in general, though, what would you say motivates you?
I guess I'm primarily motivated by having an impact on things around me. I think it's probably part Jewish guilt, but I've always been more motivated on the advocacy side of things than the for-profit side of things, and was able to make a living in the nonprofit world for a while, and have only in the last handful of years jumped into the business side of things, so to speak. But my passion still lies in finding opportunities to do advocacy work in this capacity as a consulting firm.
Yeah, no, I certainly appreciate that. And I think it's important to note that as powerful as you've been, your work has been in the nonprofits, it can be as impactful or even more so in the business world. I think a lot of people have that separation between for and nonprofit as impact. And, in reality, I've been preaching on a variety of these episodes that I think the delineation for-profit, nonprofit isn't necessarily relevant these days. It's more, are you creating a sustainable model that is creating positive change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that, we're constantly talking about as a business is, that certainly is where our values are at. And, trying to keep that in perspective and to really view it as a way to do the work that we know needs to get done and that we want to do. And just an alternative financial model, if you will, where, essentially we're doing a lot of nonprofit like work, but just in a different structure.
So where did you grow up and what was it like there?
I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, so a suburb of Phoenix, pretty affluent, relatively homogenous community. Was born there. My parents are from Ohio and escaped the bad weather to what they perceive to be good weather with Arizona. It's not my cup of tea personally, but I prefer seasons. But it was a nice place to grow up. Relatively, of course, a safe place. The schools were not so great. Arizona is a weird place. You've got a whole lot of old people that don't like paying for other people, so typically that means not a lot for young people. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely a nice place to grow up, and yeah.
Yeah, definitely an interesting part of the country. And, was there any experience you had there growing up that, really showed you the importance of giving back?
I mean, it was definitely instilled in me, as a value with my parents. Particularly, both of them, but particularly my mother has worked. She's a physical therapist who has worked with special needs children my whole life. So I mean, she spent like 50 years working with children with special needs, particularly babies. And I'd go to work with her, and that was always like a nonprofit scene, and she was doing home visits and dealing with a lot of lower income communities and whatnot. And so I think that part of the bleeding heart comes from there. And then my father was an advertising executive, so I think that I've managed to kind of put both to use in terms of finding a way to do communications related work around whether you call it progressive or values based cause.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear how you sort of melded the experiences that you learned from them. And I know you ended up going to the University of Richmond. What took you there?
It was far away from Arizona. So, I think that mixed with a bit of affirmative action and, geographically, I applied to a number of schools. I just kind of always wanted, or I don't know if I wanted to, or just had this assumption or this feeling that going to college was going to mean leaving and not being in my hometown. My sister had gone to the University of Arizona, which is where I would have gone if I stayed in Arizona. It was down in Tucson, so it's hour and a half away or so. But I had just always kind of felt like I would be going away somewhere, and so I looked at a number of schools, and University of Richmond is probably the best one I got into. And I think that partly because I was a good student. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I was definitely a top student in high school, but in terms of competition, I don't know if I would have gotten in there, but for I was from Arizona, and I know that for a fact that up until my senior year, I was the only person from Arizona there.
Oh, wow.
And my guess is that they probably like to say they've got students representing all 50 states, so that probably helped, So yeah, until my replacement showed up my senior year, I heard there was one other kid from Arizona there. So, yeah, it was a great school. It was also a suburban campus and a very traditional college campus. So I was looking like there and Boston University, which is
where I went.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
It's very urban, as you know. It's right in the middle of the city. I mean, you got like the train pulling up to your office building classrooms. So I went and looked at that, and honestly, I'm sure I don't know if it was like
it's got to be for you.
I don't know if it was going to be I don't know if it was entirely conscious, like the way I was thinking of it, but like I just felt more comfortable, like the idea of being in the middle of the city and like riding the train to class or being in like an office building was just like not how I envisioned college. And then of course I went to the University of Richmond, where they like filmed Dawson's Creek when they went to college. It's like the most college-looking college campus you could find. And honestly, it was probably like a comfort thing. I didn't think of it at the time, but it was just like it felt more, safe to me, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's definitely like direct opposites. It's interesting to think about, because like I realized when I visited BU that like I did want that city vibe and landscape. So it's interesting to hear that.
And later in life, I mean, I think like what's interesting is like I did end up choosing the more like traditional college campus, but then I lived on college campus and immediately was like, well, I don't really like this. I don't like being worried I'm gonna get in trouble all the time, and I don't like all these rules. So I was like, even though my school, like 95% of the students at my school lived on campus like all 4 years, I got the hell out of there the second it was allowed, and I lived off campus. So it's kind of interesting that what I went there for, I ended up not even being what I wanted.
Yeah. And, what did you study there? How was the experience? And I know you, in between years, did some interesting internships.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I went there not knowing what I wanted to study. And so, my freshman year, I really didn't do all that well because I was just taking, minimum requirement stuff and just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I also joined a fraternity. That didn't help either. But yeah, it wasn't until I think the classes that really caught my attention were news media and society, which is kind of like intro level journalism and about like the news and how it affects the world and whatnot, which I found captivating. And then I think it was like civil rights and civil liberties. It was like public classes in political science. My first political science class, and I didn't even really take either of those until my second semester my freshman year. And that's even after my freshman year, I was still I guess I was just of the mindset that I have to go to business. Like I had to be in business. Like I don't know, my dad was in business. It's just I assumed that's what I needed to do. I didn't want to be I wasn't gonna be a doctor, and so I figured that's what I would be doing. And I mean, I even took a business class over the summer freshman year, thinking I'd be and I just was not into it. And I then kind of realized political science, journalism were really what I was into. So I ended up being a political science major. Journalism, there was a conflict with one particular class that was required to be a major, so I was just a minor. Whatever. I consider myself a journalism student. And so I got my degree in political science. And yeah, I mean, I had some interesting internships, being in political science. That meant, I spent, instead of going abroad the semester, I probably would have gone abroad. Instead, I worked for the Virginia State Senate for a Democratic state senator in Northern Virginia, which was a very interesting experience. It was kind of my introduction to the ins and outs of state legislatures,
which are complicated.
Yeah, and it was particularly interesting. The woman who I worked for, she was the Democratic whip, and she was also really like the leader of the reproductive rights kind of voting bloc in the Democratic Party in Virginia, and was very very outspoken and outspoken and very much a leader. And that is a state where that's a touchy subject. And there were things that were making national news, like one of the Republican legislators sending around plastic fetuses in envelopes to all the Democratic lawmakers, and like it was like made national news. And like I opened that envelope, and it was just like fascinating to see that like these kind of shenanigans take place amongst state lawmakers. But it was a great opportunity, and I learned a lot about state government. They also let me do cool stuff, like I think for the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, she made a brief floor speech that they let me write, which was very cool, being a junior in college. But I also was fortunate enough to get an opportunity working for a Phoenix City Council member during the summer, and again, that was, part of it, a lot of it was dealing with constituents. But I got to see really the city government side and like constituent services, people complaining about everything from my neighbor's running a business out of their garage, or their, yard is overgrown, or, people are speeding on my street, like just like the very basics of city government. And then my job very quickly like became writing the responses and like how to deal with these people. And then they let me write some, a graduation speech for the Phoenix City Council members. So I kind of got a feel for like first, dealing with what they do on a day-to-day basis in both local and state government, and then also being able to, then put words in someone else's mouth, who's, in a position of authority or influence. So that was all great opportunities. And also had a very brief stint doing an internship for the Attorney General in Arizona, the state Attorney General, which was very pretty minor position, very briefly, but I got to write some press releases for them. So, it was just kind of like getting my foot in the door and seeing what it's like in all of these government offices.
Yeah, it seems like a good way to sort of learn the nuances of politics in different places.
To learn that you don't want to be working in government. This is a very learning by, yeah.
To see all the people that it touches, and yeah, myself like doing lobbying in state legislatures, like it's been crazy to see how different they can be in the vibes of one state to another, and there's a lot to learn in there. So I'm sure those were really valuable experiences.
Yeah, I've been incredibly fortunate. very just privileged to have those opportunities to do that work and to see how those things operate, because it's certainly, helped along the way with everything else it's done.
I was fortunate to attend the 10th anniversary celebration of Colorado's Adult Use Initiative, Amendment 64, of which you were a huge part. And you mentioned there that when you met Steve Fox, that's really what sort of put your career in motion. So can you talk about how that sort of led you down the cannabis path, or if you were already thinking about cannabis before that?
So, I mean, I got into cannabis because it's awesome. Like as a when I'd say that I went into college with more of an interest in cannabis, at least cannabis and cannabis policy, than the average person. And I was familiar. The fact that I was familiar with organizations working on legalization probably put me in like the top 1 percentile of people in college having knowledge about legalization, right? I wasn't super terribly involved or passionate, but I was interested. And then I became the subject of law enforcement harassment. I was called in as part of an investigation. I mean, I was subpoenaed by a multi-jurisdictional grand jury, drug task force that was, investigating, drugs showing up in Richmond, Virginia. And because Richmond, Virginia is on I-95, right between Florida and New York, it's a very high intensity drug trafficking area. And, in hindsight, like as I reconsider how it all went, it makes perfect sense. I mean, basically they probably busted some kid with some weed who went to my college, and they said, who do you know that uses cannabis or has access to cannabis or whatever? And then they took that list of names, they called all those people in, and they shook them down. Like, where do you get cannabis? Like, And so I got called in, and basically, they scared the shit out of me. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. Like, where do you get cannabis? Like, in parking lots at concerts. Like, I mean, which is pretty much true. Like, so it's just like, they asked me various questions, like, is it any good? Like, how much does it cost? Shit like that. And it was like, fortunately, nothing came of it. They ended up deciding I don't need to testify. I didn't have anything useful for them, I guess. But it scared the hell out of me. And I also just, it's kind of ridiculous that, like, I was a college student who used cannabis, causing no harm to myself or to others. And every level, and it's a multi-jurisdictional grand jury, like, and drug task force. So every level of law enforcement, from the campus police, the local police, state police, up to the DEA, is involved in this. It means like every level of government is worried about whether me as a college student is sitting in my dorm room smoking weed.
What a waste of resources.
Yeah, it's just like insane. And then also compare that to, in high school, I mean, I did a lot of drinking, and I've talked about this a lot. It factors into the organization I started, which I'm sure we'll get into. But my senior year of high school, I had an incident where I was taken to the emergency room with from alcohol poisoning, whole ordeal. I mean, where went to the emergency room by ambulance, woke up there, had no idea how I even got there. But what's crazy is, like, they just like let me leave. No one, like, I woke up in an emergency room and they're like, oh, you drank so much you had to be brought here by ambulance. And then they just like sent me on my way. Like, no one was there to question me. Like, how did you get enough alcohol to kill you? Who gave it to you? Like, no one really cared. But yet, if I'm taking bong hits in my dorm room and playing video games, oh my God, like, everyone wants to know. And I just thought that was insane. Yeah.
Right, and you can't really overdose. You can't overdose from that, right? You're not going to end up in the emergency room from your bong.
Yeah, and it just blew my mind, like, the hypocrisy of that, and also just like how stupid it was, and so I became very passionate about it in a lot of ways. I mean, and this is the case for a lot of people who get into drug policy reform, or at least more so it used to be than it is these days. But I mean, people are like the catalyst for people to get into this are, is being the subject of law enforcement scrutiny, and whether you're arrested or.
Yeah, it's part of a lot of people's stories, and a lot of people feel very privileged to have it not gone further than a certain point, and then you hear people. I've had people on my podcast that have been in prison for it. So
Yeah, totally. And if I was like working on legalization stuff, like people have always, come up and said, "Oh, like thank you so much for your work." Like, I mean, I've been growing marijuana for 25 years, and like thank you so much. It's like thank you so much. Like I wasn't the one like facing felony counts for going and lobbying or running a ballot initiative. Like, I mean, thank you for providing this product to people, which should be, there's no, excuse for it to be illegal. But anyway, yeah, it kind of just pissed me off. So it became an issue that I cared about. And I started looking into it more. And, the more you learn about cannabis and cannabis policy, the more, obvious all becomes. And so I became even more, in tune with all the arguments around it and all the facts, and it was just one of the issues I cared about. So when it came time to find a job, I was going to graduate. I got offered a job with the Phoenix City Council, which I had kind of just assumed would be the course I would take because it would be working for, they're like, hey, this council member wants to go places, and turns out that council member that I got a job with ended up becoming the mayor of Phoenix and is now a member of Congress. But like at the time, they're like, oh yeah, just like go work in a city council office and hitch your wagon to this guy's star and you'll be in politics. And I was like, for whatever reason, I was just not inclined to do it, and managed to find a job, luckily enough, with the Marijuana Policy Project, which is a nonprofit. It was based in DC. I applied for a job that they wouldn't give me, which in hindsight, now I know I was not qualified for. But at the time, they put out a job announcement. There's a position open. I applied. I was like, hey, I'm passionate about this. Like, I was on the dean's list. Like, give me the job. Like, I'm a political science major. Like, how could I not get this job? It's an entitled piece of shit. Like, I assumed I should get the job. And they're just like, yeah, we probably want someone with a law degree. Like,
this was 2004.
Yeah, this is summer 2004, and it was like for a legislative analyst position, which generally is usually people with law degrees or people with significant experience working in policy and in legislatures and whatnot. And so, they're like, I kept on harassing them, like, hey, just following up with you, doing all the shit that they teach you to do when you're trying to get a job. Like, and they're just like, yeah, we're still waiting on that. And then finally, they're like, okay, we see you're from Arizona and we've got some stuff going on there. Like, we're working on these congressional races. At this time, 2004, this is when the Hinchy-Rohrabacher Amendment was still the Hinchy-Rohrabacher Amendment. This was, a appropriations rider that prohibited the Justice Department from spending funds on anything that would interfere with state medical cannabis laws. And that has since 2013, it's passed multiple times and is now strongly supported, but at that time was failing miserably. But MPP was basically going around and pressuring those members of Congress who were opposed to it. And so they're like, hey, we're doing this in Arizona. We see you're from Arizona. You want to go there during the primary election? And I said, sure, as long as you bring me back out east. I thought I wanted to live out east. So I'm like, bring me back. And so they're like, yeah, we can only guarantee like 2.5 weeks of work. So I said, sure. The guy who hired me was the director of government relations at the Marijuana Policy Project named Steve Fox. Hired me, went out there, and my immediate supervisor, but like coworker / supervisor, was a guy named Brian Vicente, who had just graduated from law school at the University of Denver and was doing a Marijuana Policy Project fellowship, the little program they had going on. So he was out there doing the same work, and that's when I first met him. And then that was just during the primary election, basically just screwing with members of Congress, giving them a hard time, confronting them, making them answer questions about medical cannabis, holding up signs, handing out literature that calls them heartless, whatever, all that good stuff. But really, grassroots guerrilla pressure tactics. Primary election ended, and Steve Fox was like, hey, everyone's going to go to New Mexico to do something during the general election, but if you want, you can work the general election up in Flagstaff in Arizona. And I said, sure. So I went and ran a campaign up there doing the same stuff. But that was when I, kind of moving my way up. And then the election ended, And I went back out east and was looking for work. And Steve, still being the entitled brat that I was, I was like, okay, like what's next? And he's just like, I told you, like, no guarantees that this would, I was like, well, yeah, whatever, but like, seriously, like, what could I do? So I was, applying for things, but he was just like, well, I'll never forget. It was like during a normal Students for Sensible Drug Policy conference at University of Maryland. And he was just like, well, like, would you ever consider moving somewhere like Colorado? And I was like, probably. I hadn't really thought about it. I kind of thought I wanted to live out east. I was like, okay. So, he had this idea for a new strategy, a new approach to pushing legalization. And he kind of filled me in on it. And together, me and him and one other guy, Aaron Houston, who used to work at the Marijuana Policy Project, I wrote up a grant with their guidance, a grant proposal, and MPP gave me a very small grant to start an organization in Colorado. And that's kind of how I got into it. And, I mean, around this point in time where I was like with my parents and they're like, so is this like, like when's this part of your life going to end and you're going to actually get a job? It was like, this can't really be it. They were supportive. They were like, I had them on street corners in Flagstaff, Arizona, holding signs saying a congressman is heartless, So like they were cool, but like they're just like, is this gonna actually be something? And I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to look back on that, and it's really interesting to hear all that got set into motion. Worth mentioning, I've been on the board at MPP since 2017. An organization that I very much admire and I've learned a tremendous amount from. And, thank you for the work that you put in to make it what it is today. And, I know Steve was.
Thank you for making the work that I did there possible. It's people joining the board and providing that guidance and support with raising the money for it, giving the money for it. So.
And I know Steve Fox was such a pivotal part of where we've gotten so far and where we will go in terms of cannabis legalization. And, I'm sure our listeners may not know that he has unfortunately passed away relatively recently. So, if there's anything else you want to share on him.
I mean, I can talk about him forever, but I mean, he played a pivotal role in cannabis policies, technically, or at least deemed the first full-time cannabis lobbyist in the world, really. He joined the Marijuana Policy Project, I believe, in 2002. He had been working in Congress, working for a committee as a staffer. He joined MPP and was a full-time lobbyist there and overseeing various aspects of the organization, lobbying, and then some state-level stuff. But he hired me, and he had this idea for SAFER, which is the organization that we started out in Colorado as a way to start building support for legalization. And, he just had a great strategic mind, a great creative mind, and, really was at the crux of everything. I mean, I think, the SAFER campaign in Colorado was a critical part of what catapulted Colorado to the forefront of legalization and making it one of the first states to legalize. And then, that was really Steve's, behind almost every aspect of that, working with me and with Brian Vicente at who also was here in Colorado, I mentioned earlier. But he also, had the foresight, a lot of the major organizations, the National Cannabis Industry Association was conceptualized by Steve and started by the Marijuana Policy Project as something Steve got going. The Cannabis Trade Federation, which now is the U.S. Cannabis Council, that was also stuff Steve was very much behind. So he was just really, thinking ahead. I mean, he was constantly thinking of like, what's next? And okay, like cannabis is illegal now, but it's going to be legal. So what's that going to look like? Okay, cannabis is legal now, but it's going to need to be, like what is the next step? What's going to need to happen? And he was always thinking ahead like that, and ended up playing a huge role. Unfortunately, he passed away, right at the tail end of the pandemic era, if you will. I know it's still COVID times, but this was April 2021, and yeah, his influence cannot be overstated. overstated.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And he was certainly a pivotal force in, the industry, and the movement misses him for sure. And but back to kind of how this got started. You moved out to Colorado. You started Safer with the help of Steve. What was it? What was sort of the message that you led with?
Yeah. So essentially, up until this point, so this is like January 2005 is when we started Safer. So basically, up through 2004, the cannabis policy reform movement was very much focused on medical cannabis, and then to the extent that it was pushing for broader legalization, it was all very focused on discussing the harms of prohibition. It was very much, cannabis is bad, but prohibition's worse, so we need to regulate cannabis. I mean, that was the general message, and there had been multiple efforts, legalization efforts in California and Alaska and Nevada, like things that had lost, various efforts to take that next step to adult use, and they had failed. And public support had really kind of stalled out. It had been growing, but by that point in time, it had basically reached about 40%, a little, less than 40%, and it had stopped. It was just not going any further. Medical cannabis was still growing, support-wise, but adult use had just kind of hit this ceiling. And so Steve was trying to figure out why. He was at the Marijuana Policy Project, and he basically looked at, he was looking at survey data from various states, and he saw that when voters agreed that cannabis was safer than alcohol, they were far more likely to think it should be legal. And he kept on seeing this in polling that amongst those voters who thought marijuana was as harmful or more harmful than alcohol, the strong majority thought it should be illegal. But amongst those who thought marijuana was safer than alcohol, a strong majority thought it should be legal. So his thinking was, well, rather than try to convince people of why marijuana should be legal and all these nuanced arguments about tax revenue or about the benefits of regulation and taking it out of the hands of cartels and all the very, very good, perfectly good arguments that are very true, rather than trying to have that conversation, which groups were trying to have, let's just try to have a conversation about the fact that marijuana is safer than alcohol. Let's just educate the public about this fact. And if we can increase the percentage of people who recognize this fact, then we will just naturally increase the percentage of people who agree to be legal. And at that point in time, only about 1/3 of Americans said that they thought marijuana was safer than alcohol. It was about 1/3 safer, 1/3 as harmful, and 1/3 more harmful than alcohol. So the theory was, well, let's say we make the third that thinks marijuana is safer into 50% or 2/3. Will that mean that there will be enough support for legalization? And that was the theory. And so the Marijuana Policy Project found this interesting. Rob Campia, who was the founder, co-founder, and at the time the director of the Marijuana Policy Project, found it very compelling, but it was still very conservative. I mean, the marijuana legalization efforts, that were being well funded, like the Marijuana Policy Project, the Drug Policy Alliance, they were just not willing to go out and say marijuana is safer than alcohol. That's just too sketchy. Like, it was basically saying marijuana is okay and it's okay to use marijuana, as opposed to saying marijuana is bad but prohibition's worse. And so MPP could not do it, or they felt they could not do it. But they wanted to see what would happen. And so they decided, okay, well, here's this will be the pilot project. That's what it's referred to, a pilot project. We will give this nutty kid and his, crazy mad professor friend, a little bit of money to see what happens if they go to a state and start pushing this. And so the goal was to let's go to a state and just start hammering in the news that marijuana is safer than alcohol, and just do things to make people think about that over and over again.
And let's just interject, it's very, very, very true. And those guys knew that it was just controversial.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, no, it's a fact. Not like we were trying to hoodwink the American people. It was basically just let's go to a state and highlight this fact and see if, number one, we can actually get traction. Will people pay attention to us, or will they just ignore it? And number two, will it result in actual movement and support? And so the question was how would you get this fact out there? I mean, You drive by a state capitol on any given day, there's people outside waving signs and yelling something. So that doesn't mean that they're in the news, and it doesn't mean anyone cares. So how are we going to get people to care? And the idea initially was, well, if we're going to talk about alcohol being so dangerous and marijuana being less harmful, where is that most obvious? And college campuses was the answer. You know, there had just been some very high profile, highly publicized alcohol deaths in Colorado. And this was right at a time when, you know, college drinking has always been a thing, but it was really it was in the fall of 2004 that it became known as an epidemic. That was when the American Medical Association and other groups really sounded the alarms that binge drinking was a, quote, epidemic on college campuses. And a couple of the cases that really were pointed to as the catalyst for that were in Colorado. One was at Colorado State University as a young woman who just drank herself to death, and her friends left her alone to sleep it off, and she passed away. The other one was a young man at University of Colorado in Boulder who was pledging a fraternity and was involved in some hazing related stuff where they had him drinking so much that he ended up passing away. And so just interestingly, like both those students had parents who were crusaders, fortunately. I mean, they you know, so a lot of kids die from alcohol related things. In these two cases, you know, the girls' parents became very active and started making educational videos, and their whole thing was about not leaving your friends alone when they're drunk. The young man's parents did a whole thing about hazing, and, you know, but basically they made a big deal out of these deaths. And so they became like the poster children for the binge drinking epidemic. And it was in Colorado, both of them. So it was like, well, there's a national conversation about binge drinking taking place. It seems to be very much, you know, centered in Colorado where these two incidents happened. This is a place where we can go and talk about the fact that alcohol is dangerous and marijuana is less harmful. And so the first pilot project was to organize students at these two schools. First, I should say we started an organization called SAFER, which, you know, the idea for this was Steve's, but I came up with the name, which would become a theme throughout our work together. The creative, you know, duo of bouncing random, you know, ideas off until we come up with the best thing. But SAFER stood for Safer Alternative for Enjoyable Recreation. Kind of a stretch, but it worked.
I like it.
We just wanted the words marijuana and safer to constantly be next to each other. And so we started this group, and we basically went to these two campuses and we organized students. You know, we found a representative student at each school. We put ballot measures on the ballot in each school, student referendum questions that simply said the students don't think the penalties for marijuana, the school's penalties, should be any greater than they are for alcohol. So, you know, even though alcohol is legal and marijuana is illegal, which is what, you know, everyone would say, but alcohol is legal. Well, if you're 19 or 18 or 20, alcohol is illegal. So, I mean, they're both illegal for most college students, but why is it that a university will more quickly throw you out of school for marijuana than they would for underage drinking? Why is it that they give you far harsher punishments? Suspension instead of community service. Like, the penalties are always imbalanced. And so we just organized students to have this non-binding measure and to get that out there. And these campaigns were very vocal and they got a lot of attention. We did a good job of getting media coverage. Of course, they both passed. Big surprise. College students in Colorado think penalties for marijuana should be less. But they got a ton of attention, and we, you know, it really, I mean, it first got local attention, then statewide attention, and then it started getting national attention. And so the decision was then made, like, okay, this seems to be working. I mean, there's interest in this message, because we were basically saying, like, listen, if alcohol is killing college students and they would rather use marijuana, why would you tell them you're better off drinking? It's just stupid. And so, you know, the media, even though they were skeptical, actually in some cases saw value in this. You know, they wanted to, you know, this hypocrisy, they wanted to highlight it. So it got traction. And then from there, it was decided, like, let's try this out of the college campus setting. And we decided to run a city initiative in Denver in 2005, fall of 2005, to remove all penalties for adult marijuana possession in the city of Denver, which no city had ever done before. We did not expect that it would pass, but it was really just let's do this so that we can have again, we don't want to just be the crazy person yelling in front of the Capitol. We need something to make the media care. At college campuses, it was student ballot measures. So here, it'll be a city ballot measure. And even though people will say it's not going to do anything because it's still illegal under state law, they'll have to cover it. It's going to be on the ballot. They'll have to be, they'll have to listen. And sure enough, we did use it as a strategic initiative, got tons of media coverage, did, various publicity stunts and things that you generally would not do if you were trying to win a ballot initiative campaign. And in addition to getting all the media coverage, we ended up winning, which is a big surprise to everyone. But it really catapulted us into, getting even more attention. And from there, things just really blew up. But that was kind of the genesis of everything.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear how it started on the college campus and what that did and where you were able to go from there. I think the average person, when you're asking them, how do you think you change a major law? And it's like starting on a college campus, I don't think anyone would see that path. So really interesting to hear that. And, one thing I wanted to mention is it's come up, Brian Vicente's name has come up a couple times. He's become a friend of mine over the years as well. And, would love to hear a little bit more about the partnership you had with him and his organization and how you sort of leveraged each other's strengths.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, Brian was someone I met in Arizona when I first, graduated college, and he was doing this work too. So basically he, finished that work that, around that election, and he had just got involved with an organization that just started in Colorado called Sensible Colorado. And they were also receiving a grant from the Marijuana Policy Project to do work mostly around medical cannabis. So he was, representing patients and caregivers, going and speaking at patient meetups and doing organizing in those communities and trying to raise awareness of medical cannabis and defending the state's medical marijuana law. And so when we showed up, we were very much not doing medical cannabis. That was why we chose Colorado, is it already had a medical law. We didn't want to get into discussions about medical use. We just wanted to go straight into, should adults be able to use it for fun if they want. And so our work was very, it was complementary and could be done in tandem. So we worked closely together on a number of things, and he helped out and contributed to the things we were doing and vice versa. But yeah, we worked alongside one another. I say that in the past tense, but here we are 18 years later. We still work alongside one another, so it has not ended. We were working together and doing our own things, and then also kind of working together on a little, and then medical, so we passed the initiative in Denver. We ran a statewide initiative in Colorado just to get, again, strategically to get attention and to build. We ran another city initiative. And then meanwhile, Brian was doing the medical stuff. And, after we had passed a couple of these initiatives and done all this, that's when medical cannabis really took off, because Obama got elected, right? And when Obama got elected, he had said he wouldn't interfere with state medical marijuana laws. So all of a sudden, a lot of people were emboldened to try to start medical cannabis dispensaries. But in Colorado, it was very tricky because the medical law only allowed, well, I shouldn't say the medical law, the rules in Colorado only allowed a caregiver to help 5 patients. You can only have 5 people designate you as their caregiver. Not much of a business if you want to be a medical cannabis dispensary. So Brian represented an AIDS patient who just happened to be the test case for a law that I had passed. I had run that ballot initiative in Denver, making marijuana legal for adults. This dude, he happened to be an AIDS patient who was a medical cannabis patient, but at the time he was just arrested, and we used his case. He came to us and we took his case to court, and they dropped the charges against him and everything. But we got to know him, and he ended up being the subject for Brian's impact litigation. Brian sued the state of Colorado on behalf of this AIDS patient, basically saying, listen, this guy found someone to be his caregiver, but that caregiver's already got 5 patients. And that's, this AIDS patient should still be allowed to have this caregiver. Like, the caregiver wants to help him, caregiver has the means to help him. Why can't he? And then it kind of came to light that the state had created that rule very arbitrarily and without following, the correct process. And a judge threw that rule out and said, okay, well, this 5 patient limit is out of the door, and actually gave the state the opportunity to create a rule legitimately if they wanted to. And so this was a huge ordeal in Colorado at the time. And state, I mean, they held this mega meeting, and Brian was there and all these patients. I mean, it went for like a whole day. I mean, hours on hours. But ultimately, the state chose not to reinstall that 5-patient limit. And all of a sudden, you had dozens of dispensaries opening up because there's no longer the 5-patient limit. And Brian was really right at the forefront of all of that. And so as medical cannabis started to grow, Brian was involved and helped, because of the work that we were doing around changing public attitudes toward marijuana. When it came time for, when dispensaries were opening, whereas in other states, legislatures and governors were figuring out how to prevent dispensaries. In Colorado, our legislature decided to figure out how to allow them. And so instead of fighting it, they decided to regulate them. And Colorado became the first state in the country to regulate medical cannabis. And Brian was very much involved in that process and helped with putting that law together. So our work was kind of going side by side. Meanwhile, I was still doing work around the state, educational work, started a women's organizing effort. We were doing college campus work around the country, passing more of those measures. And when medical really blew up, and now you had hundreds of dispensaries in Colorado and they're state regulated, that's when Brian and I, we had already started to office together, for the last few years, but we decided, let's run the state initiative for legalization. And, MPP had been backing our work on both sides. And so the two of us were the co-directors of the campaign, and Steve Fox oversaw everything from DC. And MPP raised most of the money, and we ran Amendment 64, which was what made Colorado one of the first states to legalize. But that's kind of the not short version, but shorter version of the story.
Yeah, no, understood. And it's cool to hear the evolution of that, and how it sounded like there were a lot of steps along the way. And so 7 or 8 years after you started SAFER, you passed Amendment 64, but throughout that process, were you just continually making steps, or did it ever feel stagnant?
No, I mean, I think, this is a question we always get, which is like, were you surprised when Amendment 64 passed? Which my answer is no. I mean, it's like, yes, but no. And it's like, I think that, whether it's like Steve was truly that much of a genius, or it was just, part of it was just, how things fell into place. Like, we were always making progress. And I think to the extent that Steve was behind it was that, he helped from the beginning with establishing what our goals were, and they were realistic goals. So in other words, like when we first set out with SAFER and we ran that first initiative in Denver, granted it won, we didn't expect, but we were not expecting it to win. So the whole idea of running a ballot initiative without the, with the idea that we're likely going to lose, most people don't do that. They always want to think that they're doing it to win. And we did it because we wanted to build public support. We wanted to educate people. We wanted to organize people. And that was a huge lesson for me about defining what success is. And this is the number one thing. I would go to college campuses and talk to, student normal or students for sensible drug policy chapters. And they'd always, one of the big questions is like, what can you tell us, what advice do you have? And number one would always be to set realistic goals. If you go out there and say, our goal is to pass this law this year, that's a fucking tough goal, like for most people. I mean, and especially when you're talking about cannabis policy, which, yeah, we're seeing laws change pretty quickly these days, but it didn't used to be like this. These laws have been in place forever and we're not changing. So if you say, well, the only way we can be successful is if we pass this law, chances are you're not going to pass it, and then you're going to feel like you failed and things stall. If you go out and say, we're going to work on changing a law as a way to build support towards an eventual change in the law, and you judge our success based on how much news coverage did we get? How many endorsements did we get? How many volunteers have we organized? How many supporters have we put into a database? And you make it a much more realistic goal, you don't feel so, defeated. And so from the very beginning, we did happen to win that first year. So that also gave us the feeling of, well, wow, we have the chance to win too. But we really just saw the whole thing as it wasn't just about the, the outcome. It was about the process and making the process count. And so, even in 2006, we ran a statewide legalization initiative that got 41%. We were thrilled. We just wanted over 40. But like, we accomplished everything we wanted to accomplish. We got millions of dollars in earned media coverage. I mean, it was hugely successful for the amount of money that was spent. It was a success. And so I would just say that, it just made it so that we constantly felt like we were always successful because we were always accomplishing what we were setting out to, which was to build support towards this end goal. And that's when, we got to 2011. Now let's run Amendment 64. Now it's like we're ready. Now it is a realistic goal to say we're going to legalize marijuana. And so if we'd have lost, we'd have been pretty defeated. I mean, we still would have felt like we were set up for the next time, but
Yeah, no, and I get that. And certainly it's different, going through the legislature versus ballot initiatives, but I've been working for many years trying to pass medical in South Carolina. And each year, it feels like we're making some steps in the right direction. And then, we got through the Senate last year and, almost got a House floor vote. And so as frustrating as it is when we lose out each year, it still feels like we're making some progress.
Yeah, legislatures are tough. Legislators are a lot harder for so many reasons, but it's just so much out of your control. It's not like, you poll the legislature and if 51% supported, it passes. If that were the case, it'd be legal in virtually medical would be legal in every state. But you got to deal with the fact that one committee member doesn't like it and won't let a vote happen. Or, they support it, but they also need to make sure they don't upset this particular law enforcement group. It's just there's so many other variables that make it so challenging.
Yeah. I know you expressed those nuances well just now. I appreciate that. And, maybe some of this you can lend an ear to for my efforts, but you were known for some of your press stunts. Any in particular that you can tell us about?
It's hilarious that this became kind of like the calling card of, it's really defined my career in marijuana policy. And it was in some sense, this was Steve Fox, having a puppet. Don't get me wrong. I was not just being used because I thought this stuff was hilarious. And I came up with a lot of the ideas, or usually it would start with he would have an idea and then I would say, well, this is how it could be better or whatever, or vice versa. But, we did a number of things. I'd say the ones that probably got the most critically acclaimed would be, challenging the mayor of Denver to a drug duel was a big one. The mayor at the time, who then became the governor and is now a U.S. senator. But at the time, he was the mayor, and he also was the owner of a brew pub. He was the owner of the largest brew pub in the country. And so we had very intentionally and publicly labeled him a drug dealer who deals a more dangerous drug than marijuana. And then we took it to challenging him to a drug duel in which, I would be outside of the courthouse at high noon. The courthouse is where his office happened to be. It was, the Denver City County building. But it's we'll meet you at the courthouse, out front of the courthouse at high noon for a duel. And I would use marijuana and we brought a ton of his beer. And you start using your product, we'll use ours, we'll see who lasts longer. Which obviously we knew he wasn't going to do. But, and I think his comments on it was you got to give these guys credit. They'll do anything to get themselves in the news. But the point is, that story was in the news. And you can't tell that story without discussing the concept that marijuana is safer than alcohol. So that was a great one that got a lot of attention. We also chased him around the city for a whole election cycle with a person in a chicken costume and a sign that said, "Hey, Mayor Chicken Looper, what's so scary about marijuana?"
And the craziest part of all this might be that over a decade later, he's on stage with you celebrating the 10th anniversary and is one of the biggest proponents in the federal government.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the best part. It's definitely the best part of the whole thing. And honestly, when I think of the many things, probably since Steve passed away, I've probably said 4 or 5 times, legitimately said, God, I can't believe Steve's not here to see this. It's when the House passed a legalization measure, things like that. But the number one thing that I can't believe Steve is not able to see was John Hickenlooper coming to our event to say he was wrong and he supports legalization.
Give
he
me
was our
chills.
foil, you know, like he
Yeah.
was like our number one foil for years. Because his trajectory just was, I mean, so in line. Like he was the mayor, and we legalized marijuana in Denver and fought with him in Denver. Then he became the governor while we were working on it in the state, and he fought it at the state. And then he became a U.S. senator, and we're now at the federal level. And it's like he's just like his career has mirrored our efforts, or you could
And
say
give him
our
credit.
huge credit, huge credit, which I did that night. Some people told me I was a little too harsh, but like I thought I gave him really good credit. I mean,
Yeah, no, I was there. I thought you did give him great credit, and it was awesome to hear him speak and say, literally, he said, I was wrong. And it's so rare for you to hear a politician say that these days. And, I kind of liked Governor Polis's sort of jab. It's nice to see people that haven't been along for the ride here type of thing.
yeah, totally. I mean, you've got to appreciate like, and this is something that bothers me with a lot of people in politics is that this no like you'll who don't want to work with someone who used to be an opponent, or it's like they say, oh well, they're only in this for a political reason, or they're only in this now because of this reason, or whatever. Who cares? Like your goal was like from the beginning, you said, hey, you should support this or you're wrong. If they support it now, they're doing what you asked. And that means you need to give them credit for it, or at least acknowledge it. You can't just say, well, yeah, they support it now, but they still, are wrong.
And that your efforts to change minds are working. And it's unfortunate that so many people have sort of that pettiness within politics. But like when you're trying to change minds and you're successful, it's frustrating, I think, in our media and society in general, that people's past opinions haunt them to the point where it's like, well, you changed my mind. Like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, no, it's like with Biden, Biden recently issued his pardons and, his executive order calling for examinations. Because, media started calling me and saying, what do you have to say about like the timing? Do you think he's just doing this for political purposes? Do you think this is about the election? Is he just trying to get, and I was like, you know what? I don't think it matters. Like, I don't care if he literally said to his chief of staff, I hate this. I really dislike marijuana, but let's do it anyway. I don't care if he said, you know what? I'm wrong. I love marijuana. Let's do this because it's right. Either way, he's doing the right thing. So what he did as a senator 30 years ago that may have been bad, yeah, that was still bad. But if he's now the most influential political leader in the entire world and he wants to do what's right, I say go get him, Joe. Like, do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, it's incredible to see all this change that has occurred, and once you did pass Amendment 64, like how did that feel? Did you feel like, wow, I came here and I finished my goal, 8 years later?
No surprise. I mean, yes and no, but I mean, I've recanted the story before. Like for me, election night itself was the busiest I was working on legalization in my life. So it wasn't until after we got word that mission was accomplished that I was working the hardest, the hardest I ever had. I mean, that's not to say I wasn't working as hard as I could before, but it was just that it had been beaten into my skull by Steve, but also myself. Once this all clicked for me and I understood what we were doing, like just the importance, like just the communications relevance of all this, like the idea that like our goal when we set out was to educate people about the fact that marijuana is safer than alcohol, because we believe that the quickest way to end marijuana prohibition, whether it's in Colorado, whether it's in the US, whether it's globally, was to educate people about the fact marijuana is safer than alcohol. Well, there's no time in which we are going to have a bigger stage and a brighter spotlight than the day we legalize marijuana in Colorado. So even though it's like mission accomplished, like you've won, you can relax, to me, it was like, now's the time to step it up because everyone's paying attention. And so I, was up all night. Steve actually stayed up all night with me. We went to a party for a couple hours to hang out with people, but he stayed up. We went to a diner because I had to do like a live 4 a.m. interview or something. And so he wanted to get the full experience. So he stayed up with me. But it was just a matter of like taking advantage of this. Like every news outlet in the world is going to report on this. Do we want them to like have stories that say supporters are excited and say they think it's great? Or do we want them to say supporters say marijuana is safer than alcohol and they knew that voters would agree? Like, and so it was really like taking advantage of that time. So like it wasn't a sense of mission accomplished. It was a sense of like, kind of like when we won in Denver and we didn't expect it. It was like, this is going to be very helpful to our cause. Because our cause was not just Colorado and out; it was broader.
So it sounds like you had the understanding or the inkling that this had the potential to set off dominoes not only across the country but across the globe, which it has done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we figured, this is a chance for people to hear this message and to think about it. Because I mean, a lot of people, you're in this industry, I work on this issue, I'm in this industry, and there are a lot of people who are very, far more than there used to be, who are interested in this. But even still, most people don't think about cannabis much at all, or they only think about it because they like using it from time to time. It's just not an issue that plays a huge role in most people's lives on a daily basis. So for a lot of people, this was going to be the most they've heard about and the deepest they've looked into marijuana and marijuana policy in their whole lives. So let's take advantage of this moment. And, it certainly ended up being the case. And I will say, I thought that would be the biggest stage. It turned out that the first sale, so January 1st, 2014, when the first sale occurred, that actually ended up being as big, or in my opinion, a bigger deal than actually passing the law. And what's interesting is when the New York Times, they did their about face, the New York Times had always been against legalization. And, this is arguably the nation's newspaper of record, the most important, news outlet in the country. They decided to change their position on legalization. And they did a whole week of editorials on various aspects of cannabis and legalization. But it started with one big editorial explaining that they had changed their position and now they support legalization. This came out in January, right after the first sale. And the number one reason, what they cited, and it was blown up, it was like the call out quote in the editorial, was about marijuana being safer than alcohol. And so like when you think about like what's the biggest success, you could say Colorado legalized marijuana. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's arguably the biggest success. But the fact that the New York Times decided to take Colorado legalizing marijuana, use it to reverse its opinion as this major opinion leader in the world, and to cite our argument as their reason for doing so, that might be as big, if not a bigger victory.
Yeah, I mean, to think that when you started, a cannabis policy organization wasn't comfortable saying that, and here you have the New York Times saying that cannabis is safer than alcohol.
And then Obama said it. Obama then said it a couple months later.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, thank you. And I mean, obviously it also set into motion a lot of probably things that haven't gone fast enough yet, but a lot of reform in the criminal justice system and all the disproportionate enforcement that's still going on. But, push that in the right direction. So thank you as well.
Thank you. I don't know. I'm always uncomfortable with it. I appreciate it, but it's also like, there's so many people involved in this and it takes so much to do all this stuff. And the people who donate, the people who, organize this, the people who gave me the chance to work on this,
Another thing that I'll mention, and I promise we'll get past Amendment 64 at some point, but, so much in drug policy reform, even beyond, the things we directly talked about that it led to, came from this. People like Betty Aldworth continue to grow their career and their impact in drug policy. And, is there anything you want to say about Betty or about other people that sort of came out of that onto bigger things?
Oh, absolutely. Honestly, I'm confident that Betty Aldworth would have been incredibly successful in drug policy regardless.
I agree. But Betty's amazing.
Yeah, Betty, we were very lucky that Betty was, had just, I think at that point she had just stopped working for a lab. She had gotten into cannabis policy related stuff because she was doing work with a testing facility company. And then that kind of ended. And then she was doing some stuff around medical cannabis in Colorado. Excuse me. And we were very lucky that she was, at that point in time available and looking for things to do. And we were looking for help with the campaign. We were starting to hire folks, and we very much, we felt that we needed to have more. We needed a woman in a leadership role on the campaign. You had Brian and me who were leading this stuff forever, and don't get me wrong, we only had like 4 people, so it's not like we had a team of dudes. Like we just, as we were building things out, we very consciously were like, hey, we want to have women involved in this, and we want to be able to speak to women, and we want to be able to organize women, and who better? Betty was able to do that. She came on and did. She was a spokesperson and also did the organizing and was much a field director. So that was wonderful, and she did an incredible job. She's now working at MAPS. She's the communications director for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies.
I was going to mention on Betty, like she became a really good friend to me as she was the executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and someone I've had, on the list for this podcast for a long time, but she's so busy with MAPS, I don't want to dig too deep in her schedule yet, but at some point she's certainly going to be on, and excited for that. And yeah, you mentioned Christian Sederberg, obviously a huge player.
Christian had already made a name for himself in medical cannabis. He joined Brian, and they started Vicente Sederberg in 2010. That was right at the time when Colorado became the first state to regulate medical cannabis, and Christian was very involved. Basically, Brian was working on, so what happened is, like, I had been getting all this news coverage. So Sal Pace, who was at the time, a state lawmaker and was the one that was going to be heading up the medical cannabis stuff in the legislature, he called me.
And is now the chair of the board at MPP.
Oh, he's now the chair of the Marijuana Policy Project. Yeah. He called me and he's like, hey, I'm what you got to tell me about medical cannabis because we're going to do this regulation stuff. I was like, dude, not my area. Call my friend. Like, I gave it Brian Vicente's info. So Brian helped with that. And then now you had the state regulate medical cannabis, and all these businesses or would-be businesses, caregivers needing to start businesses, and people needing to figure out how to handle the business side of things in addition to the law. And Brian's getting all these calls saying, well, hey, I can help you with some of this, but I need someone with the business side. And so Christian really showed up and filled that role and brought that business, side of things. Meanwhile, Josh Capel, who was also a founding partner of Vicente Sederberg, he was Brian's law clerk for years. He had been an intern and had been kind of working on all this stuff in the background. But, when Amendment 64 passed, Christian led the implementation efforts for our campaign, which the Marijuana Policy Project supported. And Christian represented the campaign on the governor's implementation task force and really became, kind of took the wheel as the face of cannabis advocacy and good policy, because during that implementation process, that's where we really made a name for ourselves. I mean, we'd made a name for ourselves, like Brian and I, based on the advocacy and legalization and medical cannabis, but the legislature wasn't involved in any of that stuff, really. They had really been pretty resistant. And now the legislature was about to get really involved. And it was, Christian and some of our other, Joe Megacy was a lobbyist. He was also did work for the campaign. Samantha Walsh, she's a lobbyist in Colorado. This team of folks, Jordan Wellington, he was working for the legislature at the time. He's my business partner now, but he was writing this stuff for the legislature. But it was like Christian overseeing a team that really established us. When I say us, I mean the Vicente Sederberg VS strategies as the go-to folks on cannabis policy, because it became very evident very early on that we were the ones who wanted to make things work. There were clearly factions of people. There were the anti-cannabis folks who wanted to make things not work. There were the industry folks who wanted to make things work for them. And then there were the people who just wanted to make things work for the good of society. And lawmakers kind of gravitated towards that and said, like, okay, our job is to get this done, and these are the people that want to get it done. And, so we really got built a lot of credibility, and Christian was a big part of that. And then Jordan, of course, having worked in the legislature, then Jordan went on to work for the Department of Revenue and, helped draft all the rules for adult use cannabis in Colorado. He's now kind of really remains at the forefront, working in the legislature through the work we do with our clients.
It's incredible to see kind of all the all-stars that worked on that and where they are now. And it sounds like you didn't take much of a break after you passed Amendment 64. And how soon did you become the director of communications at MPP?
Pretty quickly. So, Amendment 64 passed in November, and I think I had to have started as communications director probably January 1st, I'm guessing. I mean, maybe even earlier, because I had technically been an employee for the Marijuana Policy Project during Amendment 64. So like I had been getting grant money from MPP and others, donations from others for SAFER up until Amendment 64, at which time I started to be paid directly by MPP for my work on Amendment 64. So really, it was just like a title change, right? And so I think it was probably, it might have actually been December 1st.
Yeah. So no breaks.
Yeah, man. Yeah, fucking Rob Campia, bro. Like he was not into the idea of big breaks.
No, yeah, he didn't take a rest.
But to his credit, I mean, Amendment 64 would not have happened had, he from the very beginning was like, we're going to make this happen. And he was like, I'm going to raise the money for this. I don't care if no one else chips in, but we're going to do it. And had he not said that, it wouldn't have happened. And he did follow through.
Yeah, he was great at finding the funds to make these things happen. And, built a great organization in MPP. And, I joined the board at the very end of your tenure there. I joined in May of 2017. Looks like you finished up in July of 2017.
Yep, exactly.
And then you went over to VS from there.
Yeah. So basically I was communications director for those, 4 years or what have you. And, VS had been moving along, and Steve had started VS Strategies with the Vicente Sederberg guys as kind of the policy consulting side of things. And it had kind of always been there, and it had always been never really been a question of whether I would end up going over there. Excuse me. It was always really just a question of when. At the time, things in the Marijuana Policy Project were just getting trickier with funding issues, and we'll get into details, but it just seemed like the right time for me to move. And so basically, it was all very positive. In fact, I ended up going back and working for MPP as a contractor, as a spokesperson for another year after that. But I made that jump, from the nonprofit sector to the for-profit sector. But like I said, I wanted to continue doing that kind of work. So it was really, a matter of getting into the VS strategy side, and then, starting to do that work just as a consultant as opposed to as an employee.
And, you went over to VS, sort of getting into this business side of the world. It seems like you really never weren't working with these guys, right? Like Brian and Christian and Josh, it's been a continual thing. So it wasn't like a getting the band back together. It was more like continuing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was, yeah, exactly. I mean, it was, I don't know, like Crosby, Stills. I'm the young in the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, if you will. Like, there's Crosby, Stills and Nash, and there's Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. They weren't always playing together. They'd have, but we were always, always there. So things really, everyone had started working on all sorts of different things. I mean, Brian had really kind of found his niche with like licensing. That became his, really one of the big things. He leads the licensing practice for Vicente Sederberg, and competitive licensing processes and other aspects of the industry, business stuff. Josh has gotten very into the psychedelic policy side of things. He just was the lead drafter and chairman of the campaign for Prop 122, the initiative in Colorado that just passed this year to decriminalize psilocybin and allow for regulated therapeutic use of psychedelics. And Christian was still, really on the policy side doing a ton of stuff. He was also doing a ton of legal work, but he was really a figurehead and really just making things happen in the legislature for Colorado cannabis policy, not a figurehead. I mean, really at the head of this, while also becoming a national player. He was, the chair of the U.S. Cannabis Council and doing stuff in Congress. And so, the three of them, they were all working together, but had all kind of started doing separate things, along with Sean Hauser is another one who came out of, with Amendment 64. She joined Vicente Sederberg as an associate shortly after Amendment 64 passed. And she was very involved, I think oversaw local implementation efforts for Vicente Sederberg in Sensible, Colorado. So she was very involved in getting local governments to set up their regulatory systems and whatnot. She's now, one of the nation's foremost policy leaders when it comes to hemp and cannabinoids. And so all these different people kind of have their own areas of specialization and where they're passionate. For me, it's still, on the advocacy and communication side of things. So I'm fortunate in that I get to work with all of them on whatever it is they're doing.
That's a cool role to be in that you sort of bridge the different areas.
And then I've got my own stuff too. I do and my own stuff. I say my own stuff, but the stuff that I work on without other folks that were involved with 1964 is not cannabis related. It's broader criminal justice and drug policy related.
Love to hear that. And yeah, I mean, I'm let's not dig too deep because I have a few more things I want to get to before the end, but what is some of that you're working on in the broader criminal justice?
Sure. I've worked for several years with the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, which is a nonprofit here in Colorado that's really been at the forefront of criminal justice policy. And, they've done everything from, they do things around prison reentry, they do things around voting for, people with criminal convictions. Perhaps the biggest success since I've worked with them was passing a bill in 2019 to reduce the penalty for low-level possession of all substances to a misdemeanor from a felony, because that's really what drives people to incarceration is possession of things like methamphetamine, crack, and so on. So, lowering penalties for simple possession of all those things. Lots of stuff around polling to show where Coloradans are on criminal justice matters, helped them with preventing the construction of a new jail in a county here in Colorado. So just really anything around preventing expansion of the prison population.
I mean, that's the depth of this work. That's the importance. And it's, I think you and I both found that criminal justice work through drug policy reform. And it's
absolutely,
some people on the outside might not realize just how intrinsically tied those things are. And there's a lot of work to do.
Incredibly closely tied.
And so, what is your vision for the future for VS Strategies?
Well, I mean, we remain engaged in cannabis policy on a number of levels, everything from working with folks, whether it's on ballot measures or local legislative efforts or city governments, when people want to change policy or they want guidance on policy, whether it's a business, whether it's a trade association, whether it's an advocacy organization, or whether it's the government itself, we help them develop good policy and we help them sell it, whether it's to the government or to the people. So, we've got clients that are local or state governments. We've got clients that are, nonprofits. We've got clients that are for-profit businesses. If they want to develop good policy, if they want to accomplish policy goals, obviously businesses have an interest in changing policy that will benefit them in some way, but it can be done right. It can be done in a way that doesn't just benefit them at the cost of everyone else, but can benefit everyone, including them. And we really like to work with clients that see that and see the value in that.
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear that, because so many people would just write off, oh, they're a business spending money on this. But the fact is that doing things that are good for you, if you do them right, they can be good for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, there are a lot of folks who are going to be out there trying to influence policy for one reason or another. And if we can work with someone to help them influence it in the right direction, we want to do that. So obviously, if our goals, our vision for what policy should be does not align, then that's a different story. But more often than not, we find that, once people understand how this all works and they can see that there's plenty of space for everyone to be involved in this sort of thing and to do well.
Yeah, there truly is. Like, there's so much to go around, and it's been frustrating as someone in the industry to see sort of the way it's tightened up and become more corporate and cutthroat, when the truth is there's still so much growth to be had, and so many laws left to change, and so many people left to get out of jail that, I wish there was a way that we could make it more collaborative. But it's people like you guys at VS that are helping keep us in that path.
Well, thanks, man. That's the goal. So,
So yeah, I want to just briefly read this excerpt from the Colorado Sun article about the 10-year anniversary of Amendment 64, and I think it has more broader applications. So they said, it shows how policy can change quickly under the right circumstances, how a handful of brash, dedicated people operating, at least initially, with limited resources can dramatically shift the conversation around long deadlocked issues. It shows how seeds can sprout and grow so vigorously that not even the people who planted them could foresee what they would become. And I just thought that was such a good essence of what you guys did, and the long-term impact that it could have, and also the inspiration that you're providing, not only within drug policy and criminal justice reform movements, but just to movements that aren't where they want to be in general yet.
Yeah, I share the sentiment. John Ingold wrote that piece, and he is a reporter who actually, did cover work we did for quite a while. There's no one reporter who was around the whole time. It's an unfortunate state of affairs with the media that there was no one that was just there at every turn, but he was there for a good chunk of it, and he reported on Amendment 64 throughout that campaign and afterwards, and he ended up doing that kind of recap story for the 10th anniversary. And I think he did a great job with it, and he got to see it as it was happening as well, and it was really unmistakable.
After being like sort of in the front row of a decade of legal regulated cannabis in Colorado, what are your takeaways, and how do you see how it's affected worldviews around cannabis?
Well, so I mean, Colorado and Washington passed these laws at the same time, and they both have had huge impacts. I'm obviously biased, having worked on the Colorado one and being in Colorado. I think that the Colorado law, to pass Amendment 64, has had a bit more influence. I don't know why. I think partially because Washington is on the Pacific Northwest. It's on the West Coast. It was maybe less surprising. People kind of figured it would be California or Oregon or Washington. Like, those states all had medical cannabis laws so early on, and it's just like, the fact that like when Washington, during their initiative, they had virtually no opposition. Like, the governor, the legislators, even law enforcement were all neutral, either supportive or neutral. Whereas in Colorado, it was like everyone was generally opposed, at least in terms of law enforcement and the establishment. So like when Colorado passed, it was viewed more as like, oh my gosh, this state in the relatively middle of the country, a state that was still at that time considered pretty purple, and it still is to an extent, but it's grown pretty blue recently. But I think that's also what lent to it, was that it was maybe people felt it was more representative of the whole country than, say, a West Coast state. I think that might be what it is. Honestly, I don't know exactly. But for whatever reason, a lot of people talked about Colorado, and we saw a lot of officials, a lot of people coming here after Amendment 64 and after implementation. And we also had the first sale. Washington took longer. We wrote some more, strict guardrails on timing into our law. And so we had sales begin earlier. So maybe that's part of it. But we started to have, officials from around the world coming to Colorado wanting to talk to us about how this works and how it came about and how to set it up. And that's why Vicente Sederberg, they advised Uruguay on becoming the first nation to legalize at the national level. We work with other state governments. Sometimes like for example, the National Conference of State Legislatures, they just had their big annual gathering this year, and it was in Denver. They organized field trips. I mean, essentially, they organized bus loads of lawmakers to go visit certain facilities to get tours, and we helped lead those and help do the touring and be the guides to kind of talk about the rules and why things are like the way they are. And So yeah, it's just had such an impact, and it's also really just shown people that this is doable. I mean, for a while prior to Colorado and Washington, there was a big question as to what will happen if a state does this. Will it be possible? Will it just be ignored? Will the federal government do something about it? Will it be shut down? Will it violate international treaties? Like what? There were all these questions. And after Colorado and Washington did this, and then of course the first sale took place in Colorado, and you saw that it was actually happening, it just became such a more concrete thing that was doable and realistic. And I think that really changes things for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a question I'm sure we both get asked regularly. What do you think is on the horizon for federal cannabis reform?
Well, we're still seeing what's going to happen with the makeup of Congress. It's looking like it'll be a split Congress. It'll be interesting to see if the Democrats are able to make something happen during this lame duck session. I think Cory Booker was just in the news saying now is the time.
I'll just note for listeners that we're a week past the election when we're recording.
Oh yeah, probably yeah. So just had the election, but the Democrats will still have control of both chambers and the presidency for the next couple months, and whether they can possibly pass safe banking or anything else during this time, because after that it's going to be a lot trickier when the Republicans are in control of the House in all likelihood, and it remains to be seen. And this kind of comes back to that whole notion that we talked about with state legislatures. Unfortunately, it's not the case that if you have a majority in support, you win. This is a case where there's a legislative process. It's very arduous. It's very tricky. It's very complicated. So it's not just a matter of having enough members of Congress who are supportive. It's a matter of the stars aligning and having the right people in the right committees and the right people heading those committees. And then, of course, people's priorities. So when you ask, like, what do I see on the horizon? I think some sort of significant federal reform will occur, whether it's in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. It's just so difficult to say because, I think if anything, let's look at the COVID
politics.
Well, look at the pandemic. I mean, there's another pandemic. This ain't going to be the first priority for Congress. If there's whatever, Social Security starts falling apart, or healthcare, that's one of the challenges with drug policy in general, but cannabis policy in particular. While it's incredibly important to everyone, and it's even more so important to some, relative to other things, it is not viewed as a big issue. While we recognize that it touches on everything from criminal justice to the economy, the environment, it touches all these things. It's so important. But if you're a member of Congress, especially if you're 70 or 80 years old, you don't think of it as being that important compared to healthcare, immigration, Social Security, all these other issues. And so the only time when things pass, and especially when it's a big change, like a big social policy change, like ending cannabis prohibition at the federal level, for a big change to happen, it requires a lot of attention, and it has to be a big priority for a lot of people all at once. And that's really challenging. So that's why these state level changes, which, in this most recent election, we saw 2 more states legalize cannabis, which is hugely important, because while it's not like if we reach a majority of states, something happens, but every time a state legalizes, that's 2 more senators and however many members of the House now represent a state where cannabis is legal, now represent a state where cannabis is generating X millions of dollars in revenue every year for the government, where it's creating tens of thousands of jobs, where it's generating, commerce for all sorts of other local industries. I mean, every single state, that means more and more members of Congress not necessarily support legalization, but they pay more attention to it. And it becomes more of a priority, whether they're supportive or whether they're just passively going about their day. They have to pay attention. And so that's why we see more members of Congress who didn't ever co-sponsor a bill start to co-sponsor bills, and more of those members who used to co-sponsor bills start to introduce their own bills and champion bills. And, it's just that growth. So that's what I think will continue to happen.
So you mentioned that VS and Josh Capel worked on Prop 122 to legalize psilocybin treatment and decriminalize some other substances. What are your general thoughts on the psychedelics movement and where that's going?
I think it's headed in the right direction. I mean, it's a tricky subject because, one of the, things that with SAFER that we really hammered home, and, while we were talking about cannabis at that time, the lesson is still applicable here, which is that every substance should be treated based on its relative harms or its relative impact. So, alcohol comes with a certain set of harms. Alcohol should be treated in a certain way. Cannabis comes with a certain set of potential harms. It should be treated in a certain way. So we never said like cannabis should be treated exactly the same as alcohol. They're not the same. They have a lot of differences. We said that cannabis should not be treated more restrictively than alcohol because it's less harmful. So when it comes to psychedelics, you do have products that are very unique in that in many ways, if not most, they're less harmful than cannabis or alcohol. But they also have some potential to be more problematic, particularly when it comes to people who are unfamiliar with them. And that's something we're seeing with cannabis is that there are unfamiliar consumers, new consumers or consumers who maybe haven't used in decades and are now going back and trying it. And because they aren't familiar, they're having bad experiences. They overconsume or they consume something that they didn't know how it would make them feel and that's where you start to see adverse reactions and people going to the emergency room. Fortunately, with cannabis, no one's dying from it. It's just a very uncomfortable feeling. But when it comes to a psychedelic substance, whether it's psilocybin, whether it's mescaline, whatever it might be, you have something where there is potential risk, there's potential harm. If someone doesn't know what they're doing, it can be hugely problematic. And so how do you go about making this product available to those who need it for a medical or therapeutic purpose, and also allow for it to be consumed outside of that scope, but safely? It's really tricky. And I think that 122 did a really great job of finding a healthy balance in that it's decriminalized possession of these substances, so that if you are just a consumer or you choose to use them therapeutically outside of the scope of a regimented, regulated treatment facility, if you have access to it or you cultivate it yourself or what have you, you are not going to face criminal penalties for it. You cannot sell it. If you do, you will face criminal penalties. So, there's controls in that aspect of it. But it does also allow for the creation of a system where it can be regulated and made available for these therapeutic uses in these controlled facilities with trained professionals, which gives us the ability to start, number one, helping people, most importantly, but number two, further researching and evaluating the benefits of these things and understanding them better. And so I don't foresee a retail model anywhere in the near future.
I agree.
Something commercial like with cannabis or alcohol where you can just walk into any old store or a cannabis or a dispensary. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we will see a niche in terms of types of treatment facilities, which we already do see. We see it with ketamine. We see it with other types of treatments. And we also see it with certain things outside of this country. Like ibogaine is a psychedelic that's used in substance abuse treatment and addiction treatment. That you see it taking place in other countries and not here. But you have clinics that specialize in it, and they have people who are trained in it, who understand it. They know dosage. They know where the product comes from. They know how to facilitate someone, work with someone to get a beneficial therapeutic effect. They're able to, do the work both before and afterward to make sure it's valuable, integration as it's known, to actually not just have someone use a substance and come up with some profound understanding of their problem or what's behind their, issues, but to then retain it and be able to apply it to their lives afterward. That requires training. That requires people who know what they're doing. And so I think the goal is, let's stop the bleeding with, people being criminalized for possessing these things. But at the same time, let's create a structure that allows for us to continue exploring these things, make them available, make them safe, and continue to figure out how to benefit from these amazing medicines, and to do it in a way that is respectful and equitable and mindful of their the traditional uses of them. That's another big part of this that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the history goes back thousands of years. I really appreciate that perspective. And I'm going to zoom out a bit. If everything were to end tomorrow, what would you say you're most proud of?
Everything? Like are we talking like end of days?
Yeah, let's call tomorrow the universe ends. It's about to end, and you're deciding.
I mean, if we're talking about the universe again, I would say, well, I'm pretty glad that I made it to the end. If we're talking about just me ending, that's a different story.
Sure, yeah. Let's say it's you, and these are the last things that you've accomplished, and you've accomplished them. All right, let's look back a little bit.
And honestly, like I just feel very grateful to have been able to be in the in a position to do this for a career. Because honestly, I mean, like I think most people, I was scared shitless when I finished school and was not sure what I was going to do with my life, and was able, very fortunate to be able to do something I cared about for a living, something that I felt was meaningful both for myself and for other people. And so I am extremely grateful for that. And, the fact that it's resulted in policy changes around this substance that I, do, while it's become, far less exciting than it used to be, with cannabis, it is an incredibly meaningful and important substance that provides significant benefits to people on all sorts of levels. Obviously, the most obvious being medical, but also, I think it fosters empathy. I think it fosters creativity, and I think it's made the world a better place in so many ways. It's not, I'm not blind to the fact that I do think that there have been people who have problems with it. And it's not to say that, we should ignore that. It's to say that I think by having a more honest discussion and a more honest policy, we can better avoid those problems and better deal with those problems. Rather than saying, oh shit, like someone used cannabis and they have a problem with it, let's throw them in jail or let's force them into treatment or whatever. It's that we can now actually have an honest discussion about it that I think is more likely to help people navigate that situation. So, I think it's just been, the fact that these laws have changed is so great for a lot of people, but it's not done by any means. I really, and then of course, I just think, the lessons that it's created. I think that this is an issue that a lot of people felt was not one that would get resolved in their lifetime. I've heard that from so many people, particularly older people. People my parents' age in particular. People in their 70s, 80s, who say, "I never thought I'd have seen this," and I, love hearing that, because that just means that both for those people in particular, it means that other things are possible that they may otherwise have felt won't change. And it's like, when you think something's not possible, you don't care as much about trying, or like if you think it's impossible to allow psychedelic therapy, then you're not going to pay attention. You're not going to support that campaign. You're not going to volunteer. You're not going to donate to it. So the fact that this has given people that sense of like, oh, these changes can happen, I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, agreed. And, the one question that I finish off with, with every guest since episode 1, if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
Well, it would probably be, to give everyone the greatest sense of empathy possible. because if, to the extent that other people can put themselves in other people's shoes and see things from other people's perspectives, really addresses, or at least creates a space in which any problem can be addressed. It's when people can only see things from one side that shit gets messed up. And so I think that if you could just say, all Christians see what Muslims are believe, and all Muslims see what Christians believe, and all Jews and all, or all people who are against legalization or for legalization, and everyone understands everyone. I mean, universal understanding amongst the world's people would probably go a long way.
That would go the longest of ways, certainly in our current divided world. And, very lastly, quickly, how can people support you and your impact?
Well, if you are part of a government, business, nonprofit, or trade association seeking to influence drug policy, I encourage you to visit our website at vsstrategies.com. But really, we want to work with people, whether if you're looking for a job in this space, we're not hiring right now, but we will be eventually. And we have an amazing team of people that they're all people who have been passionate about this stuff their whole lives. And to the extent that, I was given that opportunity to get involved, whether it's working on a campaign or getting a job, would love nothing more than to give that opportunity to other people when it's possible. So encourage people to stay in touch. And of course, if there's opportunities to work together, we're always interested.
Well, thank you, Mason, so much for being here today. I'm truly inspired by your story and your efforts, and I know that many of our listeners are going to be as well. And I look forward to keeping our conversation going.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of